News of the times. Triple gallows at Newgate. The shocking crimes behind the 1896 triple hanging. A Scotland Yard casebook. Welcome to News of the Times. Notorious November. In June 1896, crowds gathered outside Newgate Prison as three notorious murderers were hanged side by side. A rare and chilling spectacle, but what crimes led to this extraordinary execution? This episode uncovers two brutal Victorian murder cases: the savage killing of 79-year-old Henry Smith in his quiet Muswell Hill home, a shocking double murder in Turner Street, Whitechapel, that ended with the killer leaping 40 feet from a rooftop and partially landing on a child. Featuring rare period sources, courtroom drama and Scotland Yard's dogged pursuit of justice, this is a gripping journey into the darkest corners of 1890s London. True crime, Victorian justice and executions at dawn. And in today's end of episode further particulars segment, a retired greengrocer takes a widow for a landlady and ends up with a pawned shawl, locked up furniture and a surprise marriage proposal. He came for board and lodging. She had other plans. So then, kettle on, feet up, and prepare yourself. The quiet suburb of Muswell Hill is about to erupt into scandal, suspicion, and murder. On the morning of June the 20th, 1869, three men stood upon the gallows at Newgate. Their crimes distinct, but their fates the same. From the Illustrated Police News on the 20th of June, 1896, three notorious criminals executed at Newgate. It was the first time for many years that three murderers had met their death side by side upon the same beam. They were Alfred Milsom, aged 33, a labourer; Henry Fowler, 31, labourer, for the murder of Mr. Henry Smith at Muswell Hill; and William Seaman, 46, diver, for the murder of John Goodman Levy and Sarah Gale, his housekeeper, in Turner Street, Whitechapel. Billington, the executioner, and his assistant, Wilkinson of Bolton, slept in the prison and were astirred at 6 o'clock. Testing the apparatus. With the view of preventing any of those distressing mishaps which have occasionally added needless pain at the last moment, the executioner on the previous evening tested the arrangements that had been made in the presence of the governor of the jail and the under-sheriffs. Sacks of sand were employed to represent the convicts, and these remained suspended during the night to prove the efficiency of the ropes. A broken sleep. During the night, the sleep of the condemned men was somewhat broken. Milsom betrayed apparent anguish of mind by incoherent sounds repeated at intervals. Fowler, before retiring to rest on Monday night, said to his guard, "I'm told that the people outside think I'm going to cut up rough tomorrow morning. They're mistaken. I am satisfied. Milsom's a dirty turncoat, but I know I shall meet him level in the morning, and I am satisfied." Fowler prepared to hang. By the judicious plan adopted, the convict Fowler was the first to receive Billington's attentions. He was the first pinioned, both arms being fastened to his side and his hands behind his back, and the first sent out to the scaffold. Two warders escorted him with orders to place themselves on either side of him and watch his movements closely. Whatever might have been his attitude last week towards Milsom, it was clear from his quiet, unimpassioned look, his downcast eyes and pale, calm face, that vindictiveness no longer possessed him. He looked neither to right nor to left, but took his post submissively as directed. Seaman brought to the scaffold. In the space of 1 short minute he was followed by Seaman, also pinioned and under escort, but of one officer only, as no fears were entertained of his behaviour. Seaman's face was also pale, but it was freckled, rather a ruddy face, and the reddish-grey whiskers kept up the notion of colour. His eyes were quite steady and unfaltering, upturned for the most part in consonance with the heartfelt prayer he was uttering. His whole manner was rapt and abstracted. Milsom's demeanour. Milsom came last. He had been brought over only a short time previously from his more distant lodging, and for the last half hour occupied an ordinary cell hard by. Milsom's demeanour can hardly be called cowardly, but he was evidently much broken and unnerved. His character came out in this crucial and supreme moment. His weak, shifty eyes, his rather small, feeble face, his hesitating steps, all betrayed the weaker man. He, too, was escorted by a couple of warders, and they, with the others present, would have more than sufficient to protect him from his implacable foe. Yet he cast one brief and uneasy glance towards his companions already placed on the gallows, and seemed relieved when he found that he was not to be actually alongside Fowler. The executions begin. Fowler was set beneath the left hand or easternmost chain, his feet across the fatal crack in the boards, his back to the wall, his face to the open yard and the white-faced group of official spectators who were dressed in mourning. Rapidly, the pinions were buckled about the knees and the ankles. The rope already attached to the chain was adjusted to his neck and the noose set. The white cap, a loose bag of heavy material, was drawn over his face, and with warders prepared to support him if necessary, he was dressed for death. Seaman came next through the door in the brick wall which is in the back of the shed, and was placed beneath the fourth chain. Then Milsom, already looking more dead than alive, and with the horror of death in his eyes, was silently placed on the western end of the drop. A glance at the two strapped and hooded figures on his left side, and he too was blinded. The assistant executioner had his legs strapped and had stepped clear. Billington gave the last comprehensive look around of the skilled workmen, saw that all was ready, looked to the sheriff for the silent signal, and with a touch of his lever precipitated 3 wicked men into eternity. The trap fell true. The bodies dropped like plummets to the extent of the ropes, and 3 dull, sickening cracks and the quivering jar of the 3 swaying ropes were all that told of 3 instantaneous deaths, buried in unslaked lime. As soon as the inquest was over, the shells were filled with unsalted lime and placed in the graves prepared in the dismal flagged passageway which is the prison burying space. Here water was introduced through perforations in the lids of the coffins, and the lime was left to work. Fowler and Milsom were buried one on top of the other in the grave of O'Donnell, the Fenian, who shot Carey, the informer, against the Phoenix Park murders. Seaman is buried by their side. The crowd outside. There was a great crowd outside the prison as early as 7 o'clock in the morning, and it grew to such large proportions before 9 o'clock that the police had some difficulty in regulating the traffic. The public houses in the vicinity were crowded and appeared to be doing a roaring trade. In fact, very few of those present seemed to pay much attention to the solemnity of the scene which was being enacted inside the jail. There was a great deal of chaff and rough horseplay, and the whole scene led to the reflection as to whether Newgate was the best or most seeming place to carry out the extreme penalties of the law. The abolition of public executions has not, even after the lapse of more than a quarter of a century, done away with the morbid interest which people take in great criminals. How did we arrive here? At a rare triple hanging at Newgate Prison in 1896. 3 murderers standing side by side, dropped in unison into eternity while the crowds outside jeered, jostled and drank. To answer that, we must step back to a bitter February night in Muswell Hill, back to a solitary man, an old engineer with a mind for contraptions and a mistrust of company, and a man who wired his gardens with explosives, who dined at 10 and rose before dawn, a man who, in the final hours of his life, would face a violent reckoning at the hands of 2 desperate men. From the Illustrated Police News, the 22nd of February, 1896, burglary and murder at Muswell Hill. A mysterious and terrible murder in connection with which no arrest has up to this present been made was perpetrated late on Thursday night or during the early hours of Friday morning at Muswell Hill, a short distance from the Alexandra Palace. The facts disclose a crime of exceptional brutality and diabolical character. The victim is Mr. Henry Smith, a gentleman of 79 years of age, of independent means, who for some years past has resided alone at Muswell Lodge in Tenderdown. The house stands in its own ground, Mr. Smith having bought the plot of land some 40 years ago, and built his residence of red and grey brick with a corrugated iron roof. The front of the residence is to a great extent obscured by a high box hedge with 2 entrances, while at the back are conservatories, it having been the deceased's hobby to cultivate fruit and flowers. Mr. Smith was well known and was held in much respect by his neighbours, who were aware of the fact that he was somewhat eccentric but very methodical. He catered for himself and cooked his own food, his sole assistant in domestic work being a gardener named Webber. The deceased was a retired engineer, and since his wife's death at Brighton 20 years ago, after a brief married life, he appeared to have lived in retirement, receiving only occasional visits from a very few old friends and relatives. In appearance he was high-built, tall and active. Notwithstanding his age, it was his custom to go to bed at about 7 o'clock in the evening and get up in the morning at 4 o'clock, at which hour he would take his breakfast, dining at 10 a.m. Each night the gardener Webber left for his home at about 5:30 after seeing to the stove which heated the conservatories, and after that Mr. Smith, it would seem, used to fix in his grounds a series of wires connected with a detonating appliance which, as a practical engineer, he had invented as an alarm against thieves since the Muswell Hill burglary, and shooting affair 5 years ago. On entering the grounds surrounding the house at about 7 o'clock on Friday morning, Webber noticed that the wires of the detonating appliances were broken or cut and that the alarm had not exploded. He proceeded to the kitchen, which is the nearest part of the house to the Highgate Woods, and noticed that the bolt of the windows was broken, that the plants on the windowsill had been displaced, and that the window blinds were up, an unusual occurrence. Peering through the open window, he was shocked by the sight of his master lying on the floor in his nightshirt, with his head battered and bleeding profusely. Webber ran for assistance, calling first upon Major Challen, a neighbour, and afterwards upon a local nurseryman named Stanbrook. Both these neighbours proceeded to the scene, but refrained from interference until the arrival of Divisional Inspector Collins and his men from Hornsey. On the arrival of the inspector, Dr. Stott, the police surgeon, and Dr. Webster were summoned and found that Mr. Smith was dead. Superintendent Verdi and Detective Inspector Nutkins of the Y Division soon afterwards arrived on the scene, and a search of the premises was instituted. On the window sashes of the dining room and scullery the marks of a jemmy were observed, and it was found that the kitchen window had been forced. From the position of the body and the surrounding appearances, it was conjectured that Mr. Smith was asleep in his bedroom immediately above the kitchen when he heard the burglars at work and descended unarmed to the basement. It is surmised that upon entering the kitchen by the door leading from the passage of the house, he was struck on the head by one of the burglars. Mr. Smith appears to have rushed forward, notwithstanding the blow, and fallen backwards with his head towards the door by which he had entered. While he was in this position, the thieves appear to have tied the deceased's arms tightly to the body at the elbow with a jack towel, and also his legs with another towel. Leaving him thus apparently secure, the thieves, it is surmised, proceeded to the bedroom, and after rifling the pockets of the deceased's clothing, which was found near the bed, secured, in addition to his personal belongings, his keys, including one of a safe key in the room. It may be that during these proceedings on the part of the burglars, Mr. Smith partially recovered consciousness and then cried for assistance. At all ends, it seemed that the burglars, as precaution against an alarm, gagged the deceased by stuffing a pocket handkerchief into his mouth, and to ensure his silence, struck him many times on the head. Nearly 12 great wounds were found on the deceased's forehead and scalp, one of them being sufficient to cause death. The deceased's face and body were bruised, while the fingers of both hands were broken and lacerated, indicating that the deceased had raised his hands to protect his head from the blows directed at it. There is also a severe abdominal injury, but it is not known whether this was recently inflicted. A remarkable circumstance of the crime is that although the burglars had secured valuable property, they did not take it away with them. The deceased's safe was found open and the place ransacked. The plate and jewellery had been collected apparently for removal, but whether horrified at the extremes to which they had gone, or through fear of detection, the burglars did not carry away their booty. In the firewood basket in the kitchen near the body of the victim, the valuables were found, including the deceased's watch and chain and the property from the safe. Furthermore, the burglars left behind them in haste to depart a dark lantern, while on the lawn was found a common tobacco box supposed to have belonged to one of the men. The operations of the thieves were directed mainly to the deceased's bedroom, where the safe, deed boxes, drawers, and etc. were opened. At noon on Friday, the body of the deceased was removed on a police ambulance to the Hornsey Public Mortuary by order of the doctors, but against the wish of Mr. Smith's friends, two of whom were assisting Chief Inspector Marshall and Detective Inspector Nutkins to unravel the mystery surrounding the crime. It has not yet been possible to fix the appropriate time of the occurrence, but Gardner Webber is understood to have visited the grounds at about 11 o'clock on Thursday night, in accordance with his custom, and he then neither heard nor saw anything of a suspicious character. It would seem from the further examinations that have been made of the scene of the murder that the burglars made their way into the grounds of Muswell Lodge from Tenterdown Lane. Attempts to enter the house itself were made at several of the windows, and an entry to the kitchen window was eventually effected. Mr. Smith's habit of locking all the interior doors of the house confined the burglars to the apartment they had entered, and it is supposed that it was the noise made by them in endeavouring to open the kitchen door that awoke the attention of the victim and brought him downstairs. It is possibly put forward and repeated over and over that it is that Mr. Smith unlocked the door from immediate in the midst of the burglars, whose number the police place at 3, and was at once seized by them. Judging by the appearance of the apartment and the marks on the body of the deceased, a terrible struggle must have taken place. Although Mr. Smith was 80 years of age, he was a hale, well-preserved man, and capable of making a vigorous fight for his life. Besides, he was possessed of an iron nerve, and during his life was never known to be aware of what fear meant. The probability is that he was laid hold of as he entered, and the life and death struggle began. How desperate it was may be gathered from the fact that the marks of the murderer's fingers are clearly visible where they gripped the arms of the deceased. The kitchen table and chairs were smashed as the unfortunate and to all appearances unarmed old man struggled with his assailants, and it is possible that some of them may have received injuries which may lead to identification. Finding that they could not safely secure and silence their victim, the burglars used their crowbars or jemmies and quickly smashed him into insensibility and death. The post-mortem examination showed that no less than 9 distinct wounds from a jemmy were inflicted on the head, mostly on the forehead. One eye was entirely destroyed. The fingers were smashed on both hands, one being literally torn off. There was an ugly wound on the left wrist, and the back near the shoulders was dreadfully bruised, probably the effects of being thrown violently against the leg of a heavy kitchen table, which, together with the foundation of the surface of the table, were by the force of the blow wrenched completely away. Having thus effectively quietened their victim, the thieves proceeded to his bedroom, the only apartment in the house they attempted to search. The doors of every other room in the house were still locked when the police arrived, and on examination the contents were found to be untouched. The bedroom had been thoroughly ransacked. It is stated that the deceased had assured a confidential friend that the safe contained only the deeds of his property and other papers, but as against this there is reason to believe that it also held a considerable sum in cash, the amount being variously stated from £100 to £300. The police have issued a description of 2 men who were seen to be loitering in the neighbourhood of Muswell Lodge late on Thursday. They are described as thick-set men of medium height, dressed as labourers and wearing dark cloth caps. For many years, until his house was once burgled in his absence, Mr. Smith was in the habit of secreting his cash beneath the carpet of his bedroom, but afterwards he used a safe. It is worthy of mention that an attempt was made to break into the house a few years ago. On that occasion, the detonating apparatus on which Mr. Smith seemed to have chiefly depended for protection exploded, and the burglar was subsequently discovered in the garden insensible from fright. The success with which the alarm wires in the garden were avoided or removed on the present occasion, without exploding the detonator, is a remarkable feature in the case, and there is very little doubt that the burglars were quite familiar not only with the situation of the wires, but also with the principle on which they were supposed to act. It is said that the alarms were devised with considerable ingenuity, and that the connecting wires were so delicately strung that on more than one occasion a dog or a cat running across the garden had exploded the cartridge. They were raised on iron supports about 18 inches from the ground, and so arranged that it was almost impossible to approach the house without coming in contact with one of them. It was, however, a matter of common local knowledge that the premises were protected in this manner, and there is little doubt that the burglars were in this respect forewarned. At any rate, nearly all the wires which they had to pass over were removed from the iron supports and laid carefully on the ground. Chief Inspector Marshall has had careful models made of the footmarks left in the soft mould of the garden at the rear of Muswell Lodge by the burglars as they made their way towards Coldfall Woods. One man appears to have been barefooted, the imprint of the toes being very distinct. Another had apparently drawn socks over his boots, while the imprints of another man's footgear betrayed the class to which he belonged. While investigators at Scotland Yard scrambled to make sense of the cold-blooded killing in Muswell Hill, their attention was soon pulled 6 miles east, across the city to Turner Street near Commercial Road. There, just weeks later, another brutal scene unfolded. If the first crime shocked by its methodical savagery, the second would stun with its frenzy. 2 more victims, another private house ransacked, and a killer who left behind a trail of blood, footprints and horror. But this time there would be no vanishing into the night. In Turner Street, the killer was caught red-handed, leaping some 40 feet from a rooftop in full view of the crowd, nearly landing on a small child, and captured, bloodied and unconscious, by waiting police. If the Muswell Hill murder had been cold and silent, this one came with a roar: double murder, attempted burglary, and a chase across the rooftops of the East End. And once again, Scotland Yard found itself staring down the aftermath of extraordinary violence. From the Illustrated Police News, 11th of April, 1896. Early on Saturday afternoon, the East End of London was plunged into a state of wild excitement by the harrowing details which came to hand of one of the most brutal double murders accompanied by attempted burglary which have been recorded for years in the annals of metropolitan crime. The scene of the outrage was 31 Turner Street, Commercial Road East, not far distant from the locality in which the series of Jack the Ripper murders were perpetrated. The victims named: The victims of the assassin's knife were Mr. John Goodman Levy, aged about 74, an umbrella case manufacturer, and his housekeeper, Annie Sarah Gale, a married woman between 30 and 40 years, who had acted as a domestic servant in the Levy family for some years. It was some 6 weeks since that Mr. Levy, who was well known in the neighbourhood to be a man of prosperous circumstances, retired from the business which he had carried on for many years under the style of M.J. Myers. He seems to have been, from all accounts, a very popular personage in the surrounding district, alike from his genial disposition and the liberality with which he supported the local charities. Visited by burglars. It is a 3-storied house containing 8 rooms, the entrance being situated in Varden Street, one of the numerous thoroughfares intersecting Turner Street. According to the neighbours, it was well known that old Mr. Levy kept a considerable amount of valuable property in the shape of gold and jewellery on the premises, and within the last few weeks the house is reported to have been visited by burglars who their efforts were not rewarded with any large amount of spoil. At all events, there can be no doubt that after this attempt was made, Mr. Levy placed himself in communication with the police, and that the officers on duty kept a sharp eye on the house at night. First hint of foul play. The first suspicion of foul play which was aroused was when, shortly before 1 o'clock on Saturday morning, Mrs. Lawton, a cousin of the deceased man who lives in the same street, went round to the house in response to an invitation to dine with her relative. Much to her astonishment, she remained knocking at the door for some minutes without any response being forthcoming, and then a strange feeling came over her that something wrong had happened to the inmates within. The loud and constant rapping attracted the attention of the next-door neighbour, a tailor named Mr. William Schaefer, who went out to see what was the matter. Mrs. Lawton told him she was unable to make anyone hear at number 31, and she then suggested that she should go back to his yard and see if he could ascertain anything by getting onto the partition wall. This proposal Mr. Schaefer at once put into execution, while the woman went off to fetch other assistance. A strange man inside. Schaefer, on mounting the wall in question by means of a ladder, was astonished to see the head of a strange man in a brown cloth cap just inside the small window. He shouted out to the stranger, who immediately disappeared from view, only to reappear, however, a few minutes afterwards, when he thought that all was clear before him. In this man was very much mistaken, for Schaefer was only remaining in concealment behind a wall, and the moment he exposed himself to view, the tailor demanded what he was doing there. Fully convinced now that something wrong had happened, and apprehensive of the worst, Schaefer rushed through his house and made for the street with a view to alarming the police. On his arrival there, he found the other neighbours already collected in front of number 31. The police arrive. The constables on duty in the vicinity were immediately summoned to the spot, and a couple of them, under the guidance of Schaefer, made their way to the back of number 29, scaled the partition wall, and effected an entrance into Mr. Levy's house. Meanwhile, a strict watch was kept on both the front and back of the premises to prevent the strange man who had been seen from making his escape. The police, apprehensive that murder had been committed and that the burglars might still be in the house, invited the aid of 1 or 2 passers-by in the street, and the party then proceeded to search the premises. Mr. Levy's body found. Their worst fears were too soon realised, for half concealed behind the door of the lavatory on the ground floor at the back, they discovered the body of Mr. Levy lying in a pool of blood. His features bore an agonised look. His throat had been cut from ear to ear with some sharp instrument, while the back of the skull had been battered in with what appeared, from the terrible nature of the wounds, to be a hammer. The head and face of the dead man, as well as his clothing, were covered with bloodstains. The features bore an agonised look, although death must have been instantaneous. Continuing their search over the house, the police found drawers ransacked and overturned, while a safe on the first floor, in which Mr. Levy kept much valuable property, had been shifted from its position and turned round, evidently with a view to its being forced from the back. The body of Mrs. Gale found. In the back room on the second floor, used as a bedroom, it is understood by the housekeeper, another ghastly spectacle was witnessed. Stretched on her back on the floor by the side of the bedstead lay the dead body of Mrs. Gale in a pool of blood which was streaming in all directions. The poor woman had been frightfully mutilated. Her head was almost completely separated from her body, while, as in the case of her fellow victim, the skull had been the most unmercifully beaten with a blunt instrument of some kind. It was evident that, although taken by surprise, the housekeeper had fought fiercely for her life, for everything was in a state of wild disorder, while splashes of blood are also stated to have been found on the walls. To judge by appearance, Mrs. Gale must have been in the act of making the bed when assailed by her murderer. A hole in the ceiling. Passing to the front room on the same floor, the horrified officers at once detected a hole in the ceiling giving access to the roof. The lath and plaster had been beaten in with a hammer, and an aperture made sufficiently large enough to admit the easy passage of a man's body. While this search had been in progress, a strong contingent of police had been summoned to the scene of the tragedy, and Turner Street had rapidly filled with an excited crowd. A man on the roof. It was just when the officers had discovered the hole in the ceiling that a loud cry was raised from the street below that there was a man on the roof. A ladder was at once fetched and so placed as to enable the police to gain the roof. They, however, were too late to arrest the murderer and would-be burglar. One constable had just got his body halfway through the hole when he caught sight of a man standing in the gutter which ran around the roof. In another moment, the murderer had mounted the coping, hauled himself over by his hands, and dropped into the street below, a distance of between 40 and 50 feet. His plunder. The murderer, when he made his desperate descent, had with him 2 bundles in which, apparently, he had collected his plunder. These parcels, on being subsequently examined by the police, were found to contain several gold watches, a number of rings and other jewellery, as well as a quantity of money. Other property was also discovered hidden on the person of the burglar, which had since been identified as belonging to the deceased persons. As the man struck the pavement with the dull thud, he was at once seized by the police. Obviously, he had sustained serious injuries, for he was in an insensible condition. The man taken to hospital. An ambulance was fetched, and between 2 and 3 o'clock the man was conveyed by constables to the London hospital. Here he received the prompt attention of Mr. Lewis Smith, the senior house surgeon, who ascertained that he was suffering from concussion of the brain, a fractured right shoulder, and injuries to the right leg. The man remained in an insensible condition throughout the night, and it was not until Sunday afternoon that consciousness returned. In the course of an interview on Sunday, Mr. Lewis Smith said the patient was in a very dangerous condition, although he entertained hopes of his recovery. He had permitted no one, not even the police, to see the man, as quietude was absolutely essential. The prisoner, who spoke English well, had said nothing as yet about the murders, and up to then had not even his name had been ascertained. The officials at the hospital, who superintended the removal of the man to the ward in which he is now lying, describe him as being a person of medium height and rather sparsely built, with an iron grey moustache and beard. He seemed to be of foreign extraction and between 35 and 40 years of age. Leah Hyams, also insensible. The little girl Hyams was also picked up in an insensible condition and taken to a neighbour's house where restoratives were applied. On being brought to, she was removed to the hospital where she received the attention of the house surgeon. Her back was found to be injured, while the child was also suffering from fright. Subsequently, she was considered to have sufficiently recovered to be sent home. On inquiry being made on Sunday afternoon at her parents' home in Turner Street, it was stated that Miss Hyams complained greatly of pains about the body and was still suffering from fright. The terrible nature of the wounds. Immediately upon the discovery of the bodies being made, Doctors Michael and Ambrose, two neighbouring medical practitioners, were sent for. So terrible was the nature of the wounds that had been inflicted that it was pronounced that death in each case must have been almost instantaneous. Conjecture is still rife as to the time when the foul deed was committed. The probabilities are that the murders took place sometime after the breakfast hour, for evidence was discovered on the premises to establish the fact that the ill-fated couple had that morning partaken of breakfast as usual. The murder weapons found. It is now known that the weapons with which the murders were perpetrated consisted of a formidable-looking clasp knife and a heavy hammer. Both instruments were in the course of Saturday afternoon found on the roof. They were clotted with blood and had apparently been dropped by the burglar in his hurried flight when discovered by the police. As Seaman lay recovering in hospital from the perilous rooftop plunge that had brought his crimes to an abrupt and bloody end, nearly crushing a small child in the process, detectives at Scotland Yard were quietly closing in on another set of killers. There had been no grand spectacle at Muswell Hill, no rooftop chase, no cries from the crowd, only a bloodied, broken body and a dark lantern left behind in the night. And yet, from that one discarded clue, a cheap, battered lamp, the net began to tighten. It was the start of a relentless pursuit across England, from London to Birmingham and on to Bristol and finally to Bath, a dogged, methodical chase that would, after weeks of false leads and narrow misses, bring the killer of Henry Smith to justice. From the Illustrated Police News, the 18th of April, 1896, Muswell Hill murder. Suspects arrested at Bath on Sunday night. Exciting details. Chief Inspector Marshall and Detective Inspector Nutkins of Scotland Yard have effected the arrest at Bath of the men suspected of breaking into Muswell Lodge and murdering its owner, Mr. Henry Smith, on February the 13th last. The apprehension are the results of a most determined chase in the provinces of the two suspects during a full fortnight. The men's names are Albert Milsom and Henry Fowler, both of London, and are ex-convicts of the most desperate character. They hail from Kensal Newtown. It is stated on good authority that the police have obtained some extraordinary evidence regarding the affair. The two men whom the police have succeeded in arresting have been wanted in connection with the Muswell Hill murder for over a fortnight. Their connection with the burglary was fixed, as was stated exclusively in the evening news on Tuesday last, through the medium of a dark lantern which was left behind by the men who killed Mr. Henry Smith. The two men now in custody are well known to the police, one of them having served several long terms of imprisonment. The search following the crime disclosed to the police only evidence of a most meagre description. In fact, a common sixpenny bull's-eyed lantern, such as is used by boys on winter nights, and a common tobacco box, very much worn, and which might have belonged to a man of the labouring class, were the only real clues which the police had to work upon. Towards the end of March, however, when the negation of persistent inquiries had almost disheartened the detectives, Chief Inspector Nutkins lighted upon the fact that a well-known ex-convict with a notorious reputation had, with his family, disappeared from Kensal Newtown. It was also discovered that, in addition to his wife and two children, one 12-month-old and the other 2 years, Milsom was accompanied in his sudden and mysterious disappearance by a man named Fowler, who was only released from prison on February the 7th, when he reported himself in accordance with the terms of his licence. Fowler had no known address, but Milsom lived at 133 Southam Street, Kensal Green, and it was here that Fowler is supposed to have found shelter on the Monday following the murder. However, both men, having shown signs of financial improvement, disappeared, whither no one knew. The mother of Milsom was seen, but from a police point of view she was of no value, declaring absolute ignorance as to Milsom's whereabouts. Another relative, a lad, was not only able to show the police that they were on the right track, but his statement provided the most important evidence in the case. Asked whether Milsom had ever possessed a lantern, the lad, who is 16 years of age and said to be a brother of one of the two men in custody, identified the lamp found by the police as his own property. In order to test the consistency of his assertions, he was asked to describe the inside of the lamp, which he had not been allowed to handle. With frankness, he said that when the lamp came into his possession, it would not burn paraffin oil, the neck of the lamp being damaged. He went on to say that he got the brass ferrule of a pen holder for the purpose of providing a longer burner. This was found to be the case. Further, the lad said he had no wick with which to light the lamp, but seeing that his sister-in-law making the children some flannelette underclothing, the idea struck him that this material he could make a wick. This was accordingly done, and a piece of the flannelette wick is still in the lamp. One glass in the bull's-eye side was, he said, missing. Scotland Yard launched a relentless manhunt to track the fugitives, following leads from London to the Midlands and eventually to the western counties. The chase lasted nearly a fortnight, with detectives closing in as the men travelled in increasingly desperate conditions. Milsom, who used several aliases, was described as short with dark hair. Fowler, known for his height and a distinctive mole on his nose, had recently worked as a billiard marker. The pair were believed to be sticking together, largely because Milsom still had money while Fowler was nearly destitute. The men were finally found in the city of Bath, hiding in a rented room with their wives and a third man, Sinclair. Sinclair's wife had reportedly been funding the group's survival by pretending to read palms. Fowler attempted to attack Inspector Marshall during the arrest and was promptly struck across the head with a revolver. The room yielded a portmanteau of burglary tools and another loaded weapon hidden under a sofa. Despite the attempted resistance, the men were swiftly subdued and transported to London in custody. Inquest. A verdict of murder. Meanwhile, as Seaman lay recovering in the secure ward of London Hospital, the legal machinery he had long evaded was already grinding into motion. At Mile End, the coroner's court reconvened to determine the fate of John Goodman Levy and Annie Sarah Gale, the elderly gentleman and his housekeeper so brutally slain in Turner Street. The mood was grim, the details grimmer still. Seaman, it emerged, was no stranger to violence. Scotland Yard officers identified him as a career criminal operating under various names: William King, Saunders, and most recently William Seaman. Burglary, assault, grievous bodily harm, the list stretched back decades. He had once nearly killed a chemist with a hammer. The murder weapons found on the Turner Street rooftop bore an uncanny familiarity. A single hair, long and grey, recovered from his bloodied jacket sleeve, matched the late Mr. Levy, and the knife, a vicious-looking Green River model, had been recognised by the landlord's son as belonging to their own household. The jury did not hesitate. They returned a verdict of wilful murder in both cases. William Seaman, they ruled, was guilty. They added a formal commendation for Mr. Schaefer, the watchful tailor who had raised the alarm, and for Constable Richardson, the first to spot the killer as he scrambled across the roof in a bloody flight. The killer speaks. Under constant guard, 6 constables rotating in pairs, William Seaman began to talk. Since his identification, his tone had turned strangely resigned, even defiant. When told that the knocking at the Turner Street door that night had been Mr. Levy's cousin, he reportedly said, "I wish I'd known it was her. I'd have let her in and served her the same as the other 2. He made no plea for mercy. "I know my fate," he said. "The man who hangs me will be doing me a good service. I don't value my life." Between bouts of morbid reflection, he gave a chilling account of the murders, claiming the housekeeper had let him in, that there had been a terrible struggle upstairs before she fell, and that half an hour later the old man had surprised him in the basement. Even in his hospital bed, Seaman boasted that he'd not forgotten his knife as he fled across the roof, and that, had the police reached him sooner, he would have served them the same. The trial of William Seaman. In the final days of May 1896, William Seaman stood before the Central Criminal Court, charged with the double murder of Mr. John Goodman Levy and his housekeeper, Mrs. Annie Gale. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He had been caught red-handed, bloodied, broken, and insensible at the foot of the house from which he had just plunged. The hammer and knife, both stained with blood, were recovered from the roof where he had paused in his escape. Jewellery, money, and gold watches traced to Mr. Levy's household were found bundled in his possession. Medical testimony described the injuries to both victims as ferocious, and multiple witnesses placed Seaman in the immediate vicinity both before and after the crime. The tailor Schaefer, who had spotted a strange man in a brown cap lurking at the window, was able to identify the accused. The defence offered little more than a shrug. There was no confession, no real protestation of innocence. The only word from Seaman himself came by way of dark mutterings and his occasional chilling boasts in the hospital that he'd have killed more had he been able, that he did not value his life. The jury took little time. On the charge of wilful murder, William Seaman was found guilty. The sentence was death, and he would hang at Newgate. While the case against William Seaman had been as clear as the blood on his hands, matters were far less conclusive in the prosecution of Milsom and Fowler for the murder of the retired engineer Henry Smith. The evidence had taken weeks to assemble. The suspects had been traced across counties, and yet, when finally brought to trial, the uneasy alliance between the two men, forged in desperation and criminal enterprise, collapsed utterly. Each now turned against the other with vicious intensity, hurling accusations of betrayal and brutality across the courtroom. Milsom, pale and twitching in the dock, painted Fowler as the ruthless killer. Fowler, scornful and scathing, accused Milsom of cowardice and lies. From the Western Times, the 1st of May, 1896, Muswell Hill murder. Milsom confesses. The prisoner Milsom has made a confession to the police of the Muswell Hill crime. He declares that the only two persons were concerned, himself and Fowler. Fowler was the man who'd entered the house, committed the murder and robbed the place, while he, Milsom, remained outside in a state of great anxiety. This confession was made by Milsom on Tuesday night at Holloway Prison. At Highgate Police Court on Wednesday, Henry Fowler and Albert Milsom were charged on remand with having entered Muswell Lodge in Muswell Hill on the 20th of February and murdered Henry Smith. A constable was placed in the dock between the two prisoners, and police stood at each end of the dock. Fowler was handcuffed, but Milsom's wrist had been liberated. Major Challen, neighbour of the deceased man, said on the morning of the murder he was called to Muswell Lodge, where he saw the body of the deceased lying, bound hand and foot, in the kitchen. At this point, the prisoner Fowler fainted. He was laid on the floor of the dock and quickly brought round. After a short adjournment, Fowler, who looked pale and ill, was allowed a seat in the dock, and the proceedings were resumed. Mr. Avery said he would now put in a statement voluntarily made on Wednesday by the prisoner Milsom. Inspector Marshall said Milsom made a statement to him and signed it. To this statement produced, Milsom said the first place that he wished to say was that he had nothing to do with killing Mr. Smith and was not in the room. Fowler called at his house and asked him to assist him with the job at Muswell Hill. They went to Muswell Lodge and, getting over the front gate, opened the kitchen window. Fowler got in, and while he, Milsom, was still outside, they saw a light coming downstairs. He cried, "Bunny, out you come!" Fowler stood his ground until the key turned and the door opened. Milsom then ran back to the front entrance and heard cries of "Police! Murder!" He stood trembling, fearing he would be rounded by people, but saw nobody about and crept back. Fowler was standing at the back door, covered with blood. Milsom said, "Good God, what have you done?" Fowler said, "It is outing dues, and although you cur for leaving a man on his own, he expressed surprise that Fowler, who bragged of his strength, should kill an old man. Fowler raised his hands to strike him. If that's your game, I'm off. Fowler then cooled down and went upstairs. He brought down jewellery and said he had found a safe. They left the jewellery behind and crept to the shrubbery on the lawn, where they buried the tools. They then got into the woods and remained there 3 or 4 hours, and ultimately walked home, Fowler wearing Milsom's overcoat to hide the blood. Next day, Fowler gave him £50 and said, "That is more than some would give you after leaving a man in a hole." He took the £50 and said nothing, value approximately £8,500 in 2025. Fowler bought new clothes and left the old clothes at Milsom's house. He had a ring on his finger and a watch. Milsom, his wife, Fowler and his sweetheart went to a concert at a public house at Kilburn. Fowler got drunk and was very violent and knocked his sweetheart down several times. Subsequently, Milsom and Fowler went to Liverpool and afterwards to Cardiff, where they met the Sinclairs. Fowler was a most violent man and chased Sinclair with his revolver and up the chimney at Bristol. His, Milsom's wife, and brother did not know that he was concerned in the Muswell Hill affairs. The statement was signed Albert Milsom and every page was initialed. Doubts as to Milsom's statements. Fowler appears to have suspected Milsom's intention. At no time on Wednesday were the prisoners allowed to be near each other, both being conveyed to and from Holloway Prison under separate escort and different vehicles, Fowler for the first time being continuously handcuffed. It's understood that the Treasury have no intention at present of making any distinction between the prisoners in regard to the charge, as it thought impossible that Fowler, covered with blood, as Milsom states he was, could have turned the bedding over, opened the safe and moved about the upper floors of Muswell Lodge without staining with blood some articles or about the rooms. Furthermore, both the jemmies dug up in the grounds of Muswell Lodge on Wednesday were stained apparently with blood. Again, Milsom's statement that he had no knowledge of the burglary until the night before is contradicted by Miss Good, who met him and Fowler at Muswell Hill 2 days before. The uneasy alliance between Milsom and Fowler had long since disintegrated into bitter mutual recrimination. By the time the pair were brought to trial at the Old Bailey in May 1896, each man was determined to save himself at the expense of the other. The courtroom soon became a theatre of fury, denial, and accusation. What followed was one of the most remarkable trials the court had seen in years. From the Echo, London, the 9th of June 1896, at the Old Bailey. The trial at the Old Bailey, which commenced on May the 19th, was one of the most remarkable that had ever been witnessed there. The case for the Crown was ably handled by Mr. C. F. Gill and Mr. Horace Avery, who endeavoured successfully, as most people thought, to establish the prisoner's guilt on circumstantial evidence quite apart from their own statements. Counsel for the defence were, of course, able to point to the fact that Milsom's statement was not admissible evidence against Fowler and vice versa. Mr. Arthur Hutton for Milsom and Mr. Woodfall for Fowler pleaded ably and eloquently for their clients, although they called no witnesses for the defence. In summing up, Mr. Justice Hawkins laid considerable stress upon the circumstantial evidence and put the whole case very lucidly before the jury. Soon after the jury had retired to consider their verdict, Fowler suddenly jumped from his seat and sprang across the dock to Milsom, whom he caught by the hair and caused to fall. He was about to clutch Milsom's throat when he was pulled back by dock warders, but so great was his strength that he broke away from them, and Milsom was hurried down the staircase only just in time to escape his fellow prisoner's fury. The struggle continued for several minutes after this, and a large pane of glass was broken. A number of policemen climbed into the dock, and finally Fowler was overcome. Soon afterwards, the jury returned with a verdict of wilful murder against both the prisoners, and Fowler was handcuffed while sentence of death was passed. Then Fowler said he desired to make a statement, but the judge checked him, pointing out that that was not the right time or place for a statement. Since their condemnation, both culprits had made further statements, both verbally and in writing. Milsom still maintained that he took no part in the actual murder, and Fowler adhering to his original assertion that he was sided by Milsom throughout the ghastly business. And so, just weeks after the drama in the Old Bailey dock, the accusations, the violent outbursts, the verdict of murder, Alfred Milsom and Henry Fowler stood side by side on the scaffold at Newgate. The third man, William Seaman, already hooded and silent, waited beside them. Milsom pale and trembling, Fowler cold-eyed and unreadable. The final preparations were swift. A nod from the sheriff, a hand on the lever, and with a single motion the trap dropped, and 3 murderers fell into eternity. Outside the prison walls, a crowd cheered, jeered, and drank in the nearby pubs. Inside, the black flag and the silent ropes, the law had made its reckoning. Further particulars. In today's entry from the Annals of Further Particulars, we bring you a tale of post-retirement peril, romantic rebuff, and one very determined landlady. When a recently retired greengrocer took lodgings with a widowed woman in Deptford, he expected peace, quiet, and perhaps the occasional boiled turnip. What he got instead was a pawned shawl, a furniture hostage situation, and a marriage proposal he didn't see quite coming. Brace yourself for a courtroom exchange that spirals from tragic to farcical in fewer lines than you can say cauliflower. From the Illustrated Police News, the 7th of September, 1867, the retired greengrocer and his widowed landlady. On Mr. Maud taking his seat upon the bench, a middle-aged man stepped into the witness box and asked his worship's advice under the following circumstances. The applicant said he was recently in business in Wellington Street, Deptford, as a greengrocer. He had retired from business and had taken lodgings, being a widower, at a house of a widow residing at Deptford. He had taken his furniture into the house and had lent his late wife's shawl to wear on going to Chatham to see her son, giving her money to pay her fare by train, but she had not only pawned the shawl, but had sold the other articles belonging to him and now refused to allow him to remove his furniture. Asked, "Why does she detain your goods?" the applicant said, "That I cannot tell you." "What rent did you agree to pay?" Applicant, We never came to terms, but I gave her money whenever she wanted it, and whenever she wanted... Laughter in the midst of some concluding remark was lost. The chief clerk: what can you say about a breach of promise of marriage? Applicant: no, she can't do anything for that. But did you ever promise to marry her? Applicant: no, your worship, but she asked me if I would marry her. Loud laughter. And what answer did you give her? Applicant: I refused her proposal, and now she denies my rights to remove the furniture I've taken into her house, although I have paid her more money than my board and lodging would cost, and have given her articles of dress belonging to my late wife. Mr. Maud said he was afraid, but he could give the applicant no redress, but one of the warrant officers of the court would call upon his landlady and see what could be done in the matter. That concludes our descent into the dark corridors of 1896. If you've enjoyed the true tales from the dark corners of history, do consider subscribing or join us on Patreon for early, ad-free access and hundreds more cases from the archives. News of the Times, historical crime, at patreon.com. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, currently writing strongly worded letters to the Illustrated Police News about gallows etiquette. Until next time, keep your lantern lit and safe.